Welcome to Compact Disasters from CompactHistories.com, where we look at catastrophes, accidents, and natural disasters in short, bite-sized episodes. This is episode 92, the bombing of Air India Flight 182. The bombing of Air India Flight 182 grew out of political violence surrounding the campaign for an independent Sikh state known as Khalistan. During the early 1980s, separatist militancy intensified in Punjab, India. In June 1984, the Indian Army launched Operation Blue Star to remove armed militants from the Golden Temple complex in Amritsar, Sikhism's holiest site. The operation caused extensive damage and many deaths, generating anger among Sikhs in India and overseas. On the 31st of October 1984, Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was assassinated by two of her Sikh bodyguards. Her killing was followed by organized attacks against Sikh communities, particularly in Delhi. Thousands of people were murdered. These events encouraged support for Khalistan in parts of the Sikh diaspora, although only a small extremist minority advocated terrorism. Canada, with its large Sikh population, became one of several countries in which rival organizations raised money, distributed propaganda, and competed for influence. Among the most militant organizations was Baba Khalsa. Its leading Canadian figure, Talwinder Singh Parmar, lived in British Columbia and openly supported the use of violence. Air India was an attractive target because it was India's national airline and regularly carried members of the Indian diaspora between Canada and India. Threats had already been made against Indian officials, diplomatic buildings, and the airline. Canadian authorities possessed fragments of information suggesting that an attack might be planned. Informants warned the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the newly created Canadian Security Intelligence Service about discussions involving Air India. Indian officials also requested stronger protection for the airline. In May 1985, the Indian High Commission submitted a diplomatic note concerning threats against Indian missions and aircraft. Air India subsequently requested strict security measures for its Canadian operations. CSIS had Parmar under surveillance. On the 4th of June, agents followed him and another man from the Vancouver area to Vancouver Island, where they visited Inderjit Singh Rayat, an electrician and mechanic. The men later entered a wooded area. The agents heard a loud explosion, but apparently interpreted it as a firearms test rather than the trial of an explosive device. The significance of the incident became clear only after the bombing. The available intelligence did not produce a complete picture of the conspiracy. Information was divided between agencies, assessments were inconsistent, and no authority successfully connected the warnings with the preparations being observed in British Columbia. While Air India flights received additional protection at some Canadian airports, the conspirators were planning to exploit connecting services operated by another airline. By June 1985, political threats had developed into a coordinated operation involving 2 bombs, 2 routes, and 2 aircraft intended to be destroyed within a short period. During the months before the bombing, Inderjit Singh Rayat acquired components that could be used to construct explosive devices. These included digital automobile clocks, batteries, electrical relays, blasting caps, and a radio tuner. He also sought dynamite, sometimes claiming that it was needed to remove tree stumps. Witnesses later described questions he had asked about explosives and electrical circuits. Investigators eventually connected Rayat with an experimental explosion carried out on Vancouver Island. Forensic evidence suggested that 2 similar devices were subsequently assembled. Each was concealed inside luggage and incorporated a timer intended to detonate after the suitcase had passed through airport security. One was directed towards Air India Flight 182. The other was intended for Air India Flight 301, which was scheduled to fly from Tokyo to Bangkok. On the 20th of June 1985, reservations were made under the names M. Singh and L. Singh. Neither identity was conclusively connected to a genuine traveller. The first reservation involved a CP Air flight from Vancouver to Toronto, followed by connections with Air India. The second involved CP Air Flight 003 from Vancouver to Tokyo, with an onward connection to Air India Flight 301. On the 22nd of June, a man presenting himself as Monsieur Singh arrived at Vancouver International Airport with a suitcase. Although he did not have a confirmed seat for every stage of the journey, he persuaded a CP Air employee to label the bag through to Air India. The suitcase was loaded aboard CP Air Flight 060 to Toronto, but M. Singh did not board. At Toronto, the unaccompanied bag was transferred to Air India Flight 181. Security procedures failed at several points. Passenger and baggage records were not reconciled before the CP Air flight departed, so the absence of the person who had checked in the suitcase did not lead to its removal. In Toronto, Air India had been screening checked luggage because of the recognized threat against the airline. However, the X-ray machine broke down after only part of the baggage had been examined. Staff used a portable explosive detector for the remaining cases, despite doubts about its effectiveness. It was never established which method was applied to the bomb suitcase. Flight 181 flew from Toronto to Montreal, where it received additional passengers and luggage. The service was then redesignated Flight 182 for its journey to London, Delhi and Bombay, now called Mumbai. The aircraft was a Boeing 747 named Emperor Kanishka. Its passengers included families beginning summer holidays, children travelling to see relatives, and people returning to India for extended visits. The passenger who had checked in the fatal suitcase had never boarded any of the flights. Nevertheless, his luggage had crossed Canada and entered the cargo hold of a fully occupied international airliner. When Flight 182 left Montreal, the timer inside that suitcase was already running. Air India Flight 182 departed Montreal shortly after midnight on the 23rd of June 1985. It carried 307 passengers and 22 crew members. Of the 329 people aboard, 268 were Canadian citizens. There were also 27 British citizens, 22 Indian citizens, 10 Americans, and 2 passengers whose nationality was not determined. More than 80 of those aboard were children. The Boeing 747 crossed the Atlantic at an altitude of approximately 31,000 feet. The flight appeared routine, and its crew reported no serious mechanical problem or security emergency. As the aircraft approached Irish-controlled airspace, air traffic controllers instructed it to contact the Shannon Control Center. Flight 182 did not respond. At approximately 7:14 a.m., Coordinated Universal Time, the bomb exploded in the aircraft's cargo hold. The blast breached the fuselage, produced a rapid loss of pressure, and disrupted vital systems. The aircraft broke apart in mid-air and fell into the Atlantic Ocean, roughly 180 kilometers off the southwest coast of Ireland. There had been no warning that would have allowed the crew to make an emergency call. Ships and aircraft were dispatched to the location after wreckage, and bodies were reported on the surface. A merchant vessel, the Laurentian Forest, was among the first ships to encounter the debris. Irish naval vessels, helicopters, emergency services, and civilian organizations then joined an operation that changed rapidly from rescue to recovery. There were no survivors. Families travelled to Cork, where a hospital was temporarily used to receive and identify the dead. Irish officials, medical personnel and local volunteers supported relatives who had arrived with little information about what had happened. Only 132 bodies were recovered. Many of the victims and most of the wreckage remained in deep water, complicating both identification and investigation. The flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder were recovered from the seabed in July. They indicated that the aircraft had suffered a sudden and catastrophic event rather than a gradual mechanical failure. Sections of wreckage and evidence from recovered bodies supported the conclusion that an explosion had occurred during flight. In January 1986, the Canadian Aviation Safety Board concluded that a bomb placed in the forward cargo compartment had destroyed the aircraft. The bombing killed members of 29 families and left children, parents and partners without their closest relatives. At the time, it was the deadliest terrorist attack against a civilian aircraft and the worst mass murder in Canadian history. Yet the geographical spread of the disaster initially obscured its Canadian character. The aircraft belonged to an Indian airline, the wreckage fell near Ireland, and most victims were Canadians of Indian heritage. Even before Flight 182 disappeared, another explosion had occurred thousands of kilometers away. That second attack, at Tokyo's Narita airport, would demonstrate that the destruction of the Kanishka was part of a coordinated attempt to bomb 2 Air India aircraft on the same day. The second suitcase began its journey at Vancouver International Airport under the name L. Singh. It was checked onto CP Air Flight 003, which was travelling directly to Tokyo. From there, the baggage label instructed airport staff to transfer it to Air India Flight 301, scheduled to fly from Tokyo to Bangkok and then continue towards India. L. Singh did not board the CP Air aircraft. Flight 003 arrived at Narita Airport early on the 23rd of June. At approximately 6:19 a.m., Coordinated Universal Time, baggage handlers were moving luggage from the Canadian aircraft through the terminal when the suitcase exploded. The blast killed 2 Japanese baggage handlers, Hideo Asano and Hideharu Koda, and injured 4 of their colleagues. Had the bomb remained intact until it was loaded aboard Flight 301, the death toll could have included everyone on that aircraft. The Narita explosion occurred about 55 minutes before Flight 182 was destroyed near Ireland. The closeness of the timings and the matching journeys from Vancouver suggested that the attacks formed a single conspiracy. The early detonation in Tokyo also left investigators with physical evidence that was largely unavailable from the wreckage of Flight 182. Japanese specialists recovered fragments of a Sanyo radio tuner, a digital clock, wiring, a battery, and other components. The tuner was traced to a model sold in British Columbia. Receipts and enquiries led Canadian investigators towards Inderjit Singh Rayat, who had purchased electronic components matching some of those found at Narita. Searches of his home and workplace uncovered additional materials connected with the construction and testing of explosive devices. The wider investigation became one of the largest and most expensive in Canadian history. More than 200 RCMP investigators and support personnel were deployed during its early stages. Police worked with agencies in Japan, Ireland, India, Britain, and the United States. They examined airline documents, intercepted communications, interviewed witnesses, and reconstructed the movement of the 2 suitcases through Vancouver Airport. Progress remained extremely difficult. Most of the physical evidence from Flight 182 lay more than 1,800 meters below the Atlantic. Members of the extremist networks under investigation were reluctant to cooperate, while potential witnesses reported threats and intimidation. Some witnesses altered their accounts, and others were later judged unreliable. Relations between CSIS and the RCMP created further problems. CSIS was responsible for collecting security intelligence, while the RCMP needed admissible evidence for criminal prosecutions. Large numbers of CSIS surveillance recordings were erased under the service's retention policies, even though the material concerned people who later became central to the investigation. This destroyed potentially valuable evidence and complicated efforts to prove who had directed the plot. The surviving fragments from Narita established how the second device had been constructed and provided the clearest route to a prosecution. The investigation could demonstrate that 2 bombs had left Vancouver, but identifying every conspirator and proving individual responsibility beyond reasonable doubt would be far harder. Police searched the properties of Talwinder Singh Parmar, Inderjit Singh Rayat, and several other suspects in November 1985. Parmar and Rayat were arrested on weapons, explosives, and conspiracy allegations, but investigators did not yet possess enough admissible evidence to prosecute them for the bombings. Rayat later moved to Britain, while Parmar eventually left Canada and returned to India. British police arrested Rayat in 1988. After being extradited to Canada, he was tried in connection with the Narita explosion. In 1991, a British Columbia court convicted him of manslaughter and explosives offences. He received a 10-year prison sentence. The conviction established his involvement in constructing the Narita device, but did not identify everyone who had planned the attacks or taken the suitcases to Vancouver airport. Parmar was killed by police in India in 1992. Canadian investigators continued to regard him as a central organizer of the conspiracy, but his death removed any possibility that he could be questioned or tried. The investigation instead concentrated on other suspected participants and on witnesses who claimed to have heard admissions about the bombing. In October 2000, Canadian police arrested Ripudaman Singh Malik and Ajaib Singh Bagri. Rayat was also charged in relation to Flight 182. In February 2003, shortly before the main trial, Rayat pleaded guilty to manslaughter for assisting in the construction of the bomb that destroyed the aircraft. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, in addition to the sentence already served for the Narita bombing. The trial of Malik and Bagri lasted from April 2003 until December 2004. Prosecutors alleged that the defendants had participated in the conspiracy to destroy both aircraft. Much of the case depended on witnesses who said the accused had made incriminating statements. The defense challenged their credibility, motives, and changing recollections. On the 16th of March 2005, Justice Ian Josephson acquitted both men on all charges. His judgment accepted that a single conspiracy had produced the 2 bombs, but concluded that the prosecution had not proved Malik's or Bagri's participation beyond reasonable doubt. Several important witnesses were found to be unreliable. The acquittals did not amount to a finding that no conspiracy had existed. They meant that the evidence against these particular defendants did not meet the criminal standard required for conviction. Rayat's testimony at the trial was evasive and repeatedly denied knowledge of the other conspirators. He was later convicted of perjury and received a 9-year sentence. He remains the only person convicted in connection with the construction of the bombs, while no one has been convicted of murdering the 329 people aboard Flight 182. For the victims' families, the conclusion of the trial intensified long-standing demands for an examination of the failures surrounding the attack. The criminal process had established parts of what happened, but it had not answered why the warnings were missed, why the bombs passed through airport security, or why the investigation had failed to bring the principal organizers to justice. Following the 2005 acquittals, former Ontario Premier Bob Rae reviewed the unresolved questions surrounding the bombing. His report described Flight 182 as a Canadian catastrophe and recommended a focused public inquiry. In 2006, the Canadian government appointed retired Supreme Court Justice John Major to lead the Commission of Inquiry into the investigation of the bombing of Air India Flight 182. The inquiry examined the pre-bombing intelligence, airport security, the relationship between CSIS and the RCMP, terrorist financing, witness protection, and the management of terrorism prosecutions. It also heard from victims' relatives, many of whom described feeling that Canadian institutions had treated the bombing as a foreign tragedy, rather than an attack planned in Canada against predominantly Canadian victims. Published in June 2010, the Commission's final report described a cascading series of errors. Agencies had received warnings but failed to assess and share them effectively. CSIS and the RCMP did not cooperate adequately. Surveillance resources were limited at crucial moments, and potentially useful recordings were destroyed. Air safety measures failed to prevent 2 unaccompanied suitcases from entering the international baggage system. The Commission also concluded that Canada had been poorly prepared to investigate and prosecute a complex terrorist conspiracy. Intelligence material could not always be transformed into courtroom evidence. Witness protection arrangements were inadequate, and responsibility was spread between departments without sufficient central coordination. The report made 64 recommendations covering intelligence sharing, aviation security, terrorist financing, prosecutions, and support for affected families. Some aviation changes had begun immediately after the attack. Canadian authorities strengthened the screening of checked baggage and introduced measures intended to prevent luggage from travelling without its passenger. Internationally, passenger baggage reconciliation became a central protection against bombs placed in unaccompanied suitcases. Later reforms expanded explosive detection, airport screening, and coordination between security agencies. On the 23rd of June 2010, the 25th anniversary of the bombing, Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologised on behalf of the Canadian government. He acknowledged the institutional failures that had preceded the attack and the way families had been treated during its aftermath. Canada now observes the 23rd of June as the National Day of Remembrance for victims of terrorism. Memorials stand in Canada and at Ahakista in County Cork, near the waters where the aircraft fell. They commemorate the 329 passengers and crew aboard Flight 182, as well as Hideo Asano and Hideharu Koda, who died at Narita Airport. The memorials also reflect the international character of the response, particularly the assistance given by Irish communities to victims' relatives. The bombing remains the deadliest terrorist attack in Canadian history. Its legacy is found not only in aviation regulations and intelligence reforms, but also in the recognition that violence planned within a diaspora community cannot be dismissed as a distant foreign conflict. The central lesson of Flight 182 is that warnings, however fragmented, must be shared, assessed, and acted upon before a developing conspiracy reaches the airport. That brings us to the end of this episode of Compact Disasters, part of the Compact Histories Network. If you enjoyed it, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss any future episodes. And consider leaving a rating or review, as it really helps new listeners find the show. You can find more episodes at compactdisasters.com, where you can also explore our other podcasts covering biographies, history, true crime, warfare, and mysteries. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. Finally, please consider supporting the show directly by buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/disasterscoffee to see how. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.